Good afternoon, everyone. The Paralysis Resource Center at the Christopher and Anna Reeve Foundation is excited to bring to you a webinar in collaboration with the Job Accommodation Network titled Job Accommodations and the ADA. Our speaker for today is Lisa Mathis, lead consultant for the Job Accommodation Network. Lisa joined the Motor team as a consultant in February 2011 and has since provided one-on-one guidance on workplace accommodations and the Americans with Disabilities Act. She assists employees and employers with understanding their rights and responsibilities under the ADA and in identifying accommodation solutions for employees with motor impairments. Lisa also presents on the ADA and accommodation issues at various national conferences and provides specialized trainings to JAN audiences and advocacy groups. Please feel free to ask questions using the box on the left side of your screen. We will be answering those questions at the conclusion of the presentation. Lastly, there will be a survey at the end, and we ask that you complete the survey so we can continue improving on these webinars for the future. With that being said, I will pass it over to Lisa.
Okay, thank you so much. So my name's Lisa, and like he said, I'm a consultant here at the Job Accommodation Network. So I just wanted to give you all an idea of the topics we're going to be covering today. First, I'm going to explain just exactly what we do at the Job Accommodation Network, or JAN, as many people call us. Then we're going to go over the do's and don'ts of disclosing a disability. Then I do want to quickly touch on some ADA basics, just so we're all on the same page of what an employer has to do versus what a person with a disability is entitled to. And then we're going to get into some accommodation ideas for various limitations and get into some situation and solutions. Then, of course, we will leave some time at the end to address any questions that you may have for me. So what do we do at JAN? Consultants at JAN specialize in answering questions about the federal laws that apply to disability rights. Our primary focus is Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, along with the ADA Amendments Act. But we'll also talk to people about the Rehabilitation Act that applies to the federal workers. At JAN, we provide consultation on all aspects of workplace accommodations for people with disabilities. This allows us to help our customers resolve those job accommodation issues and come up with and implement successful accommodations. Consultants at JAN work with our clients to try and identify possible solutions that can enable people with disabilities or limitations to perform their jobs effectively. We can talk employment issues regarding a wide range of medical conditions in any career and try to provide ideas that could be tailored to the specific need or limitation. When you call us, we really don't care about a diagnosis and whether it's even truly an ADA disability. We just want to know the limitations so we could advise on possible accommodation solutions. We've aided Fortune 500 companies with ADA compliance issues down to a mom and pop shop looking for a product modification. So it's safe to say we help all customers in all industries and in all job categories. The best part of JAN has to be that we are a free service. We provide our information and consulting services free of charge because we're funded by the Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, which enables us to do this at no cost to our customers. We're confidential, so what we discuss regarding the work environment or disability, it stays between us. The program assistants that answer your call will ask for your name and disability, but all that information is truly confidential as it stays in-house. And the only reason we ask for a name is that we can track case notes. If you happen to call back with a follow-up, we can pick up right where we left off. We are a national service, and although we're based in West Virginia, we do take calls from all over the country and U.S. territories. I feel like we're easy to use because whenever you call us, you get a real person on our end. We're also easy to use because whichever way you prefer to contact us, we'll probably use it. We're very accessible. All services are done electronically, so that we're doing phone calls, emails, chat, and then our extensive website, and we're available on all social media platforms. We talk to everyone on the gamut, from employers to the employee, to service providers, to friends and family members. But the biggest portion of our calls do come from employers and individuals with disabilities. We can be pretty busy here at Jan. Just last year, we had over 50,000 contacts between people calling us, emailing, and submitting questions using our Jan On Demand feature. We also have the live chat on our website, and then, of course, people hitting us up on Facebook and Twitter. But then we also had over 18 million people visit our website at askjan.org just last year. So for being a small office in West Virginia, we really do take a lot of inquiries. We also have a quarterly newsletter so people can keep up with different accommodation topics or changes in the ADA. And we do offer our services in Spanish as well. So you can view our site in Spanish, or you can give us a call and we'll direct you to our Spanish consultant that we have on staff. Jan has an extensive website. On there, you're going to find a running list of A to Z lists where you can scroll through and find a diagnosis and probably have a Jan publication link with a brief overview of that condition, and then it often will break down common limitations, and from there you can see possible accommodations that could be useful. Then a similar idea for the limitation in work-related function page. Depending on what information you have or you're seeking, you can go to either tab, the limitation or the work-related function, and find accommodations for that limitation, such as bending or lifting. Or for the work-related function tab, you would have things like move items or workstation access. Then, of course, the by topic page has various topics such as legal resources or general topics like parking. And then there's an accommodation tab that has definitions for each type of accommodation. Some accommodations have longer publication links there. So I really encourage all users to start at the A to Z pages and look through those things for accommodation information. We've also developed these practical guidances for both the employee and the employer, where it's a summary of common issues that people have when requesting accommodations, and it explains how to address them appropriately. Again, on the website, we have multiple resources for even more information on the ADA and the Rehab Act, our ADA library. We link the most comprehensive publications and various EEOC guidances. The EEOC is the Equal Enforcement Opportunity Commission. That's who enforces the federal ADA law. There are sample policies on this page, along with contact information for the enforcing agencies. And then last on this slide, we have the interactive process, which we have 3 publications, which includes one specifically for federal workers, one for service providers, and one for private industry. Another large portion of our job is to refer people to the appropriate channel to further assist them. We can refer people to vendors, which could be manufacturers or distributors of products or technologies that we may recommend as an accommodation. We may refer people to an enforcing agency if someone feels they need to file a discrimination claim, which could be your state human rights agency or the EEOC. Other organizations could be disability groups. We have working relationships with various groups where they refer clients to us for the accommodation help, or vice versa if they need additional medical information. State programs are a great resource, such as the State Assistive Technology Project. They'll let people borrow or test out these assistive technologies or devices and pieces of equipment to see if that's truly what they need before making the investment for a workplace accommodation. And then, of course, state vocational rehabs are good for the job seekers. They can help people find jobs or further their education and training. I love vocational rehab. It's a good place if you want additional local resources. So JAN was established in 1983 as a national free service. Been at this for over 30 years. We do strive to be very knowledgeable and stay up to date on the new ADA information, products, assistive tech, changes in legislature, and national workplace trends. Our consultants have a wide variety of backgrounds, such as rehab counseling, engineering, law, social work, business, communication, and speech pathology. We currently have 4 teams, including the sensory, the motor, The cognitive psych is one team, and then small business. And we also have ADA specialists and web accessibility specialists on staff. I personally serve on the motor team, so I field calls with a wide range of medical conditions, paraplegia to cumulative trauma to hip impairments. The sensory team, they specialize in hearing impairments, vision issues, respiratory and allergies. And then the cognitive psych team, they deal with the mental health impairments, depression, OCD, the learning disabilities, or even addiction issues. And then lastly, that self-employment entrepreneurship team, they'll work with individuals with disabilities to try to get their business idea off the ground, try and find local funding and all the things necessary to start a small business. I did want to highlight a newish feature to the website, the JAN Workplace Accommodation Toolkit. This is JAN's free online workplace accommodation toolkit, which provides employers with the tools needed to create a more disability inclusive and compliant workplace. It has the best emergency practices in providing accommodations in the workplace. There's 3 drawers with information depending on your role. There's a drawer for recruiters and managers and supervisors. Then there's a drawer for accommodation experts and consultants. And then the last drawer is for employees with disabilities and coworkers trying to support them. So it has tailored information depending on your role. I wanted to show you guys 2 of the most popular publications on the JAN site. The left is the Employee Practical Guide to Requesting and Negotiating Accommodations. This really lays out the employer obligations versus the employee's entitlements and explains the ADA in a super easy to understand manner. And then the right is a screenshot of the practical guidance for medical professionals to help patients write accommodation letters. It's sort of like a Mad Libs where you just plug in the patient's name, the limitations, and a requested accommodation. And it has the template in a paragraph format that makes it super simple to accompany those initial requests for accommodations. And both of these are linked on the askjan.org website. Okay, so now let's get started on the accommodation process, and with that comes disclosure. Disclosing a disability can be a stressful moment, but you do have the option as to when to disclose. You can disclose at any point during the application and interview process, or once you get on the job. You're never required to disclose a disability before you get hired, unless you would need an accommodation for the application or interview process. Same goes for once you're on the job. You only have to disclose if you want to make a request for an accommodation. So there's a few reasons why you'd want to disclose. One, when you need an accommodation to help you perform an aspect of your job. For example, say you have some issues typing due to a hand impairment of some sort, and your job requires typing. So that's when you would probably want to request an accommodation, possibly speech recognition software to perform the typing aspect of your job. Another reason you want to disclose is to enjoy equal benefits or privileges of employment. This may be requesting a closer parking space or gaining access to the company break room. Those things wouldn't necessarily help you perform your actual job, but since everyone else has access to those things, you should as well. Another reason someone may want to disclose their disability is going to be to explain an unusual circumstance. An example of that type of situation might be if an employee wants to better explain why they're experiencing odd side effects of a new medication they may be taking. To request an accommodation, you simply have to let your employer know that you need a change at work because of a medical condition. It's not required that you use special ADA language or terminology. An employer should be prepared to respond to accommodation requests that use quote-unquote plain English. So the interactive process should start, and that's when an employer can ask for limited medical information about your disability and need for accommodation. While it's not required under the ADA to put your request for accommodation in writing, Here at JAN, we do suggest you do it that way. We suggest you give a written request to either your supervisor, your human resource rep, or if your company has a designated disability program manager, that could work as well. If you end up making your request verbally, you could always follow it up with a written memo. Again, regardless of the way you decide to request, whether it's verbally or in writing, the employer should initiate that interactive process and move forward with the information they need. You don't want to disclose too soon. We often get calls about employees or applicants feeling they're not being 100% honest if they don't disclose that they have a disability to their employer. Although it's a personal decision, do realize that you're not required to disclose unless you're requesting an accommodation for the application process. You don't want to wait and disclose too late either. You wouldn't want to wait until you're having major performance problems at work. The employer doesn't have to take back or rescind any disciplinary action that happened before they were made aware of the disability caused work-related issues. And then speaking of performance issues, an employer doesn't have to lower performance standards as a form of an accommodation. So you may need to request an accommodation to bring you up to meet those performance standards. In short, as soon as you realize you're having difficulty performing at work, disclose and request an accommodation. And then lastly, you don't want to disclose to everyone. There's no obligation to share all the details about a disability to coworkers or colleagues. Workers may know that you're entitled to accommodations under federal law, but shouldn't be told that it was because of a medical condition. ADA requires employers to keep disability and medical info confidential and limits access to that, typically to HR and supervisors. For additional information on disclosure, JAN's developed this publication, The Do's and Don'ts of Disclosure, that walks you through the reasons to disclose and time frame in which you may want to disclose. Another publication that I refer callers quite often to is the publication there on the right, the Ideas for Writing an Accommodation Request Letter, which is a template that explains what information to include regarding your disability and limitations, and helps you draft up a letter to give to your employer when you feel you want to make a formal request. As I mentioned earlier, it's not required that these requests be in writing. We just recommend it so you have that paper trail of what you're requesting, and it can better document exactly when you made that request. Okay, moving on to some ADA basics. Really just wanted to remind people or inform people of general premises of the ADA and accommodations. So we're talking about what's required under the ADA. This is going to be the bare minimum requirement. Some states have greater protections for employees with disabilities, so you're going to want to be familiar with your state laws that may overlap with ADA requirements. Of course, I talk to employers every day, and I inform them if you want to voluntarily go above and beyond what the ADA requires, that's great too. EEOC wouldn't penalize you for doing so. But what we're talking about today is the minimum employers must do under federal law related to providing reasonable accommodations for applicants and employees with disabilities. Okay, so let's talk about an employer's obligations under ADA. This is going to give you an idea of what you can expect when engaging in the interactive process with your employers. Choose among effective options. An employer doesn't necessarily have to give the preferred accommodation as long as they're providing an effective one, meaning the accommodation enables the person with a disability to perform the essential functions of their job. But EEOC has also said if there's multiple effective options, primary considerations should be given to the preference of the employee. The reasonable accommodation obligation applies only to accommodations that reduce barriers to employment related to the person's disability. It doesn't apply to accommodations that a disabled person may request for some other reason. You must be qualified. In order to be protected by the ADA, this means that the applicant or employee must satisfy job requirements for educational background, employment experience, the skills and licenses, and any other qualification standards that are job-related. And you must be able to perform those tasks that are essential to the job with or without reasonable accommodation. Employers don't have to provide an accommodation that poses an undue hardship on the employer. It just means that if an accommodation requires significant difficulty or expense to provide, then it could constitute an undue hardship. Employers also don't have to provide personal use items. These are typically the hearing aids, the wheelchairs, prosthetics, or medication, those items that are needed on and off the job. They don't have to provide. Employers don't have to remove essential job functions. Those are the primary fundamental duties of a job. So if the employee can't do an essential function of their job and there's no accommodations that would enable her to do that function, then the employee may not be qualified for the job because the employer doesn't have to remove essential functions. However, the employer would need to consider reassigning the employee to do a job that she can do, a vacant job that she can do. They don't have to create jobs. Speaking of reassignment, when reassigning an employee as an accommodation, you don't have to create new jobs or bump other employees from their jobs. Reassignment is for current vacancies or soon-to-be vacancies. If we know that Bob is retiring in 3 weeks, that should probably be considered a vacancy for a reassignment purpose today. Then employers also don't have to lower production standards, whether they're qualitative or quantitative, as long as they're uniformly applied to employees with and without disabilities. If someone has to make 25 widgets in 8 hours, that's fine, but you may have to make accommodations to enable that person to produce those 25 widgets. Okay, so now we want to get into the accommodation ideas for a couple different limitations we see most often in the workplace. Today we're going to focus on the physical limitations. These limitations could stem from disabilities from birth or could be acquired injuries and illnesses. General considerations for motor limitations in the workplace. Under Title I, employers are not required to make existing facilities accessible until a particular applicant or employee with a disability needs an accommodation. And then that modification should meet the individual's needs. Keep in mind that employers don't have to make changes or provide access in places or facilities that would not be used by that individual. Allow personal attendance for toileting, grooming, and or eating. While an employer may not have to provide the personal attendant for these tasks, the accommodation obligation is permitting that the attendant be on the premises to aid the employee with a disability. So typically an employer doesn't have to provide personal attendance because those aren't work-related tasks. But I do want to mention that this is a tad different for federal employees, as 501 of the Rehab Act, part of their affirmative action program, they do furnish these personal attendant services for targeted disabilities. So federal workers have a different entitlement than private sector. Permit a service animal. Service animal can provide physical assistance to someone who uses a wheelchair, for example, retrieving dropped items, opening doors, pulling the wheelchair, or helping someone maintain balance when ambulating. And you always want to be mindful of workstation access, implementing ergonomic principles and chairs. If you need help with that, feel free to call for product ideas. Height adjustable desk table for a person who can't work comfortably at an existing desk. Accessible office machines such as copiers, faxes, so a person with limited mobility can access them from a seated position. Voice-activated speakerphone, large button phone, automatic dialing system, voicemail system, and or headset, depending on the person's limitations and preferences. Alternative access for computers, such as the speech recognition, the trackballs, key guards, alternative keyboards or mouse sticks, and then office supplies and frequently used materials on most accessible shelves or drawers, so a person who can't reach or has limited access can still gain access. Moving on to the walking and standing limitations in the workplace, it could be to limit the need to walk completely. This can be done by utilizing other assistive technologies or means of communication, such as email, instant messaging, two-way radios, and cell phones. Anti-fatigue matting, it provides a buffer between the floor surface and the individual's body, helps relieve standing for a prolonged time. You might want to consider ergomates, which is basically wearable anti-fatigue matting, making it easier and more comfortable to walk on hard surfaces as it absorbs a lot of the impact. The matting can be strapped to almost any footwear and is available online. Stand-lean stools, they take the weight off the person, but also gives the reach and accessibility as if a person were standing. It can give the illusion of standing as well for behind-the-counter positions, such as a cashier or a pharmacist. And if we can't limit the distance one would have to walk for their job tasks, then providing or allowing the use of a mobility device could be considered. This can range from the wheelchairs, scooters, to personal transportation devices, and walkers and canes. Often we see limitations in lifting and carrying accommodation ideas for those issues. Some sort of assistive technology or a piece of equipment is often what we see. The tool balancers that hold the weight of a tool, often paired with an ergonomic tool. We have an extensive vendor list for compact lifting devices, and the rest of the listed equipment you see on the A to Z page on askjan.org. Like I mentioned, if you go by limitation and select lifting, and then also if you select carrying, you'll see some different products on the website. As far as non-product accommodation ideas, job restructuring. This could be changing how an essential, those primary functions, is performed, or it could also refer to removing a marginal task, removing that secondary duty. Under the ADA, an employer never has to remove those essential functions, but can do so if they wish. They can always go above and beyond the law if they want to. Okay, so now let's look at the types of accommodations that may be required, absent undue hardship. First up, employers must consider purchasing or modifying work-related equipment or products. This accommodation is pretty clear-cut for most employers, but sometimes it's hard for them to keep up on all the products that are available. This is a big area where Jan can help. We have extensive knowledge about modifying equipment an employer might already have, as well as information about where to purchase new products. Let's look at an example. First example we have to providing equipment. An HR rep called us looking for ways to accommodate an employee. They were originally in a respiratory therapist role, but since having a stroke, they now have hand tremors, so doing certain medical procedures was hard for them. So the company is looking at reassignment to a new role, one in the sleep lab, but was concerned about the employee's ability to perform the computer tasks in the sleep lab. Jan referred the employer to multiple vendors for mouse adapters. There are tremor limiting mice on the market and large button keyboards with key guards that help keep fingers on top of the button you're trying to strike. We also pushed out a vendor list for speech recognition software. Again, Jan doesn't recommend or endorse any one product, but we just provide the information for products that we know exist and let you as the callers make those determinations. Now we have a broker who wasn't meeting production standards because they had a hard time typing due to finger numbness. After speaking with a Jan consultant, the employer did end up providing word prediction software for the time being, but now understood speech recognition software for the future use if need be. Another type of accommodation is making the workplace accessible. Employers need to make sure that all employees are able to get in and out of the workplace and use common areas such as the restrooms, break rooms, and exercise rooms. When picturing worksite accessibility, I always think of a wheelchair ramp into an entrance of a building. So something people don't really think about is the air quality of the worksite. People with chemical and fragrance sensitivities or allergies, they also need equal benefits to those areas as well. So we want to be mindful that accessibility is really fully encompassing for all types of limitations and disabilities. Here are our example. We have a college professor who had leg weakness, therefore had trouble walking long distances. The employer assigned the employee to a dedicated building so she wasn't trekking all over campus. The employer also installed handrails throughout that one building to help the employee walk. Now we have a new hire, happened to be in a wheelchair and noticed the break room had 3 steps leading down into it. The new hire mentioned it to the employer, so the employer ended up calling us to learn what next steps should be. Here, Jan explained accessibility rules for employees under Title I, and they ended up moving that break room for all employees and lowered the microwave and soap dispensers. This created a more inclusive workplace and was effective for the employee. Here, the employer did report spending a one-time cost of $500, increased diversity, and retained a valued employee. Next type of accommodation required by ADA is job restructuring. When it comes to job restructuring, I've mentioned this, it could mean a couple things. Oftentimes it's removing or reallocating marginal tasks, those secondary duties, or it could be changing how or when essential functions or marginal functions are performed, because we know employers do not have to remove those essential functions. So one really important thing employers should be doing is sorting out what functions are essential and what functions are determined to be marginal. Looking at a job restructuring example, a secretary had weakness and pain in her hands, so she couldn't lift the packages that were being delivered. For the accommodation, the employer assigned another worker to catch those deliveries and get them where they needed to be. So this enabled the secretary to still be productive, so she wasn't working in pain from all the lifting she shouldn't have been doing. Now we have a custodian who worked at a county government. He had balance and gait issues, so he had a hard time doing his job of general building maintenance, of emptying trash, sweeping, and working on the ground. So the employer permitted him to use a motorized cart to carry trash bins, and he was able to use a riding floor polisher. So he could just sit in the seat and the balance issues weren't as prevalent, and he was still performing his job effectively. Another basic accommodation has to do with modifying schedules or allowing leave time. I can tell you we get a lot of questions about how much leave employers have to provide. I can also tell you that there's not a definite time frame under ADA. It's a case-by-case determination. We can help employers with this type of accommodation by discussing options and undue hardship issues, suggesting in some cases alternatives to leave, and providing information about related laws such as Workers' Compensation and Family and Medical Leave Act. But regarding modifying a schedule, let's look at a typical example. An employee who works in the call center has a gastrointestinal disorder and has to take frequent bathroom breaks. Productivity is measured by the number of calls taken. Yes, his employer allowed him to take all the breaks he needed, exempt him from meeting those productivity standards. Remember, we said earlier that employers don't lower productivity standards as an accommodation. So this employer denies the request, but does contact Jan to see if there's other options. Jan was able to give the employer some ideas that the employer was able to use. The employer continued to require the employee to meet the productivity standards, but moved the employee closer to the restroom and allowed him to have flexible breaks and make up the time for any breaks taken beyond what all employees are entitled to. With these accommodations, the employee was able to meet production standards. We included this example because it illustrates a typical accommodation related to schedule, but also demonstrates an important requirement of the ADA. Just because an employer can't provide the accommodation the employee requests doesn't mean that's the end of the employer's obligation. Like the employer in this example, employers should enter into the interactive process and work with the individual and outside resources, such as Jan, to come up with other accommodation ideas. Otherwise, the employer may be guilty of failing to provide an accommodation under the ADA. Moving on, we have a construction worker who had depression stemming from another underlying medical condition. So the employer permitted ADA leave while the worker got treatment, and then once he was cleared to return to work, he was given a reduced schedule to slowly transition back to full-time. Now we have an office manager with a rare disorder plus depression. She was slacking at work with her deadline. She couldn't stay focused and struggled with her assignments. So she brought it up with her supervisor, which was a good tactic as you don't want to wait before it's too late to ask for accommodation. They discussed the issues, and the employer gave the employee time to call her support people. In this case, it was friends and family, but sometimes that may look like calling a therapist or a counselor. So with this employee calling her friends and family during her periodic breaks, this helped her regroup and in turn increase productivity. Now we have a concierge at a resort. Must have been out on leave and now wants to return to work, but limited hours to start off and permission to use a cane. So after talking to the employer, Jan suggested use of a stool to help with those walking issues, extra breaks when needed, and then also a modified schedule. We also went over removing non-essential functions, so he was focused on the essential functions with the hours he was working. And then at Jan, we also explained the basic premise of Family Medical Leave Act. Okay, I want to briefly mention that reassignment is an accommodation under the ADA, but it's considered the accommodation of last resort. This means that employers are expected to try and accommodate in the current job unless the employer and employee agree it is the most effective option to jump to reassignment. If the employee prefers to stay in his current job, the employer must try to accommodate before considering reassignment. So sometimes it's just not possible to accommodate in the current role. If that's the case, then reassignment to another position might be the only reasonable accommodation available. And remember, as I mentioned earlier, employers are not required to create new jobs or bump other employees when reassigning as an accommodation. They only have to consider vacant positions for which the employee is qualified, but they're not prohibited from creating a new job if they choose or even bumping another employee. In most cases, employers prefer not to bump other employees, but may ask if someone wants to voluntarily change jobs. An employee with a spinal cord injury utilized public transportation to get to and from work. Then the bus route changed and was a big problem for the employee. So the employer ended up calling Jan for their commute obligation and accommodation ideas. After learning that, while an employer doesn't have to physically transport employees to work unless they do so for all employees, an employer may have to change the location of work when an employee can't commute because of a disability. So here the employer reassigns the employee to another work site that was along a bus route that was effective for the employee. Okay, that wraps up our situation and solutions. This is the home page, and you'll see the popular A to Z list that I was talking about earlier, and other links such as ADA library, publications, and training. We also have the live chat feature on the home page there on the right. And I always tell people, if you have trouble navigating and finding something, feel free to reach out. If you chat, call, or email, we're happy to pull info for you or help you find what you are looking for. We're still teleworking here at JAN, so we're changing the way we talk to clients. You can definitely still call us at the 800 number, but the quickest way to get in touch with a consultant is going to be that live chat feature on askjan.org, or to send us an email at jan@askjan.org. But if you prefer to speak on the phone, call the 800 number and someone will get back to you. No worries about that. And now I'm going to see what type of questions came in. Okay, how do you think COVID-19 will change appointment for persons with disabilities and the need or feasibility of an accommodation? Okay, so yes, we are getting lots of COVID questions. That's probably the bulk of my workload in recent times. I think the need of accommodation, are evolving and changing due to the nature of the virus evolving and changing and what we're learning on a day-to-day basis. But now I think the undue hardship limitation might be changing as far as the employer goes. So something I'm seeing now, a lot of the forced telework where employers previously said, this job isn't doable remotely, in-house or nothing, and now that we're being forced to telework, employers are seeing employees can still be productive even from home. So I think it's going to change the landscape, especially of telework, once the COVID stuff is all behind us. So I think that's going to work in our favor as folks with disabilities, because this COVID period has kind of served as a trial or a temporary accommodation of telework that we all wanted before and were denied. But yeah, if you needed accommodations pre-COVID or due to COVID, really it's going to be that same process of establishing yourself as a person with a disability, make a formal request, and request it, engaging in that interactive process. There's a couple more questions here. What do you recommend as the best areas for individuals with disabilities to look for jobs in this post-COVID-19 environment? Okay, so typically, JAN is not a job placement service. I just want to put out that disclaimer. So we always refer job seekers on. So the biggest resource I'm going to say is the state vocational rehab. We'll always ask an individual with a disability if they've contacted their state VR, just because they're a local resource and that's their bread and butter is placement. But we do have a job seeker resource page on the homepage of the askjan.org site. So you can go to the job seeker section, and there you'll see that we do have linked a couple resources for placement, and I have them here. They're gettinghired.com, and then there's Ability Jobs, and then there's Hire Disability Solutions. Hire being H-I-R-E. And so you can get those written resources on the job seeker page on askjan.org. But State VR, I think, is going to be a good go-to because that's what they do day in and day out. And I know Getting Hired has a pool of employers who they're ready and willing to hire people with disabilities, so they often don't make people jump through those hoops to get accommodations. They just see the value in people with disabilities, and that's all part of their, business marketing is they want to recruit people with disabilities. So oftentimes those are good employers to work for. So those are all employment tools that are linked on the website. Let's see, another question. How do you start the conversation about trying to go back to work to see what type of position they might be willing to offer you when your previous job is long gone without risking your long-term disability if you do not go back to work? So assuming you were on a leave of some sort, okay, I want to say for long-term disability, that's a separate law from ADA. And so first and foremost, people on short and long-term disability want to contact their state insurance department because that's who mandates those laws. And so ADA is going to be a separate entity from long-term disability. So as far as ADA goes, because I can't counsel anyone on short and long-term disability issues, as far as ADA goes, you want to try to get back to work. So you're going to open up the dialogue with your employer, say, hey, these are my restrictions, but I'm trying to engage in the interactive process and see, can I get accommodated in a type of job I was doing before? What are the vacancies that are available now? Because I could get reassigned into one of those roles depending on the limitations and the accommodations that are feasible for that specific employer. So really making that formal request and kind of providing updated medical information to see present day what the limitations look like and what you're able to do safely in the workplace. Let's see. Another question. What's the best way for those of us who are working either part-time or full-time prior to COVID to be able to safely get back into the workforce? Specifically, I worked in education, so there's many questions about how schools are going to reopen. Again, I'm going to say engage in that interactive process. First, you're going to want to see what the standard safety policies and practices are going to be and what those entail at the school. And then you're going to need to make a determination. Do you need, accommodations beyond the standard practice? Do you need more safety, protective equipment, or safety measures put in place? So you might have to request those as an accommodation. So again, you're going to be getting the supporting medical documentation to kind of establish what you need due to COVID exposure and request that reasonable accommodation under the ADA. So, many of those requests present day are looking like telework, and you mentioned you were in education. So, being assigned classes that you can remote teach effectively and maybe changing the classes to give you that telework compatibility. Or it might be a secluded office where you're not sharing with a bunch of colleagues and spreading germs. It might be protective personal equipment. It might be modifying schedule where you're not working alongside others, at the core business times. You're working before or after when it's less people, less exposure. We have lots of accommodation ideas and information. We have a new COVID webpage linked on the Ask Jan site that you can see and kind of see how it's evolving and changing and what we're putting out. We're always updating that. I think that might be all the questions. Oh, no, okay. I'm really good at technology. I'm getting through these questions. What about individuals with vision and or hearing and social distancing requirements? Not all disabled can social distance in the same way, speaking as someone in the education field. Okay, yeah. That probably went hand in hand with just my last question. It's going to be that case-by-case determination, what your limitations are versus the work environment that you're performing in. And so what you individual is going to be that case-by-case individual assessment of what you physically need versus what the employer can provide absent undue hardship. And that's going to look different by each employer. So really just having that two-way conversation, that interactive process to see what they can do for you and what you medically need. Okay, I think I went through all the Q&A.
Wonderful.
Okay,
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. That was super informative, and thank you again for your time. Everybody who participated, thank you again for joining us today, this afternoon, on this for this webinar. Quick reminder that for those who attended, please complete the survey at the conclusion of this presentation. We look forward to seeing how we can partner up again with Jen in the future. And again, thank you everybody for attending. That wraps it up on our end. I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.